Hello, I'm Christina Davis, Director of the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to join us for a fascinating discussion about how politics interacts with trade and electoral institutions. The title of our seminar is Domestic Institutions, Geographic Concentration, Agricultural Liberalization, Evidence from Remote Censored Cropland Data and Elite Interviews. So this may sound like it's a very technical political science research project, and it is. It's very rigorous empirical research into the question of when and how states are liberalizing one of the most sensitive products, agriculture. But it also touches on the big broad themes about why is there so much backlash against globalization? And we have seen this changing electoral outcomes in the United States and elsewhere. And as we try to understand why some countries are starting to question, is globalization in their best interests? And politicians are coming up with new strategies to frame liberal trade as the latest threat. What is the response across different countries? Why is it that some countries have had more backlash than others? And today we're going to learn about the variation across countries and the way some have been choosing when and how they compensate for some of the challenges of free trade. Because we've all known that free trade brings winners and losers, and the issue is how can you take some of the money from the winners to compensate the losers? And this presentation is really a great opportunity for us to learn from one of the leading scholars in the field of international political economy and Japanese politics. So I would like to introduce you to Megumi Naoi. She is the Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of California, San Diego. She's been doing research on international comparative political economy and has a very broad range of studies. She's built an agenda that looks at how politics shapes trade policy. Her book, Building Legislative Coalitions for Free Trade in Asia, was published from Cambridge University Press in 2015, receiving many prizes, and is a very important look at how the way politicians engage with each other shapes the way they choose to liberalize. Building on this theme, she's written many articles in top political science journals, from the American Journal of Political Science to International Organization and many other journals. We're going to hear today about work related to her study on voting with the wallet, consumers, income earners, and the new politics of globalization backlash. She's writing a paper that is looking at some of these dimensions about how politics interacts with domestic politics and international trade. The seminar today is part of the special series on policy innovations and crises, supported by a grant from the Japan Foundation. And I'd like to remind you of our normal Zoom etiquette. Oh, I guess we have a seminar next week too. Sorry, first I will announce our seminar next week is the Associates Panel, Social Basis of Democratic Governance, where we will feature our associates. And for today, our Zoom etiquette is that you should wait and raise your hand in the chat or reactions if you'd like to ask a question. All right. Well, I'm very happy now to turn things over to Megumi Naoi.
Thank you so much, Christina, for a very generous introduction. And I'm so sorry that I couldn't be there in person today. So this is a project with In-sung Kim at MIT and Tomoya Sasaki, a graduate student at MIT who is here today. And it's sponsored by Center for Global Partnership and Japan Foundation. And this grant was received with Shujiro Urata and Kazunobu Hayakawa, and then In-sung Kim. So the puzzle, as Christina described, that this project tried to answer is that the trade liberalization, we have all known from economics classes that, I'm sorry, improve citizens' welfare in the long run. However, it produces winners and losers in the short run. And this has become a source of backlash that we see today. So the typical solution that economists and political scientists have advocated for is to compensate losers. Why don't we redistribute income from winners and to losers and buy off this opposition to globalization? So this Corsian solution advocated by Ronald Coase has been the staple toolkit for the government to tame the backlash against globalization. However, we see the failure of this compensation in many places. Protectionist policies have swept the United States and Europe, but seems like it has not been the case in Japan. We also witness polarized responses to compensation, people hating social welfare, people hating compensation. We see this polarized response to compensation and social welfare. So the question is why we see the failure of compensation. Why can we make it work to redistribute income from winners and losers and keep the open economy survive? So what we argue here is that the typical answer to this question is to look at the voters, what voters see as globalization and what type of economic hardship that the voters are getting, or is this a status threats or cultural threats coming from immigration, et cetera, et cetera. So we step back and say, is this really from the voters? And maybe there's something bigger that's going on that we have not noticed. So what we focus on here is a constitutional structures of governments determining the failure of compensation. To do so, we developed this idea of compensation contract. Basically, what it is that we see compensation politics as a contract between executive branch that negotiates trade agreements and the legislative branch that delivers compensation. So executive promises compensation to legislators who are concerned that their district's gonna get affected by trade liberalization. And legislators listen to these compensation promises and say, okay, if you can deliver this, we could support this liberalization, vote yes on trade liberalization, trade agreements, and deliver ratification. Okay, so this is a compensation contract between executive branch and legislative branch. We argue that when this contract is credible, that legislators believe that it is coming and executives can follow through the promises, then it reduces legislators' opposition to liberalization and leads to successful ratification with compensation. However, there are two major issues in making this contract credible. We argue that parliamentary system of governments have advantage over presidential system of governments due to fusion, not separation of power. These are a bunch of jargons that you learn in political science classes, but we focus in particular on two mechanisms. One is that parliamentary systems have a stronger party discipline. When party leaders tell backbenchers to do something, like vote for controversial trade liberalization, in the parliamentary system, backbenchers tend to follow the leader's order more than presidential system. The second mechanism we focus on is overlapping agents between executive and legislatures. Cabinet ministers, prime ministers are legislators. They've been elected from the same electoral system with other legislators. Whereas in the presidential system, executive members are generally appointed and their backgrounds are very different from typical congressional members. So this overlapping agents in the parliamentary system, we argue, lower the transaction cost of forming this compensation contract and make the contract more credible and enforceable in parliamentary systems. So because of these institutional differences between parliamentary system and presidential system, we argue that arena of contract enforcement differs between the two systems. In parliamentary system, the contract is formed and enforced within the party. Because party discipline is strong, party leaders just have to tell their party members, this is what we're going to do, you follow us. Whereas presidential system, because party discipline is weak and there's no overlapping agents between the two branches, the contracts tend to be enforced on the legislative floor. When they deliberate ratification of trade agreements, that's when the compensation deliberation happens as well. And here, contract is enforced on legislative deliberation. So here, the number is power. More people supporting ratification and compensation, the better the contract will be enforced. So because of this arena of contract enforcement being different between parliamentary system and presidential system, it gives us different prediction about different type of products being liberalized and compensated in the parliamentary system and presidential system. So we argue that parliamentary system tend to liberalize and compensate geographically concentrated industries because the contract enforcement occurs within the party. And when the deal is made within the party, it's actually easier to make promises and deliver with a fewer number of districts or legislators that are concerned about liberalization. So concentration helps because you are dealing with fewer number of districts. Whereas presidential system, the number is power in a legislative process. You need to go over the majority threshold. You need to have a 50% more legislators saying yes to either compensation bills or ratification bills, right? That they tend to liberalize and compensate diffused industries because number is power. You are dealing with a larger number of districts and legislators when the industry is diffused across different districts. So that's our argument. We test this with new measure of crop level geographic concentration of agricultural commodities using remote sensed and census-based Cropland data. And we matched this with newly collected tariff data for 237 PTAs, preferential trade agreements, signed between 1990 to 2016. So this is a very fine-grained product level trade liberalization data and the geographic concentration data that's mostly gathered through remote sensing, satellite data. And what we do is the outcome we're interested in is liberalization. So compared to before signing preferential trade agreements, these agricultural products tend to be protected with most favored nation clause rates, okay? So what we compare is that compared to this MFN rates, how much trade liberalization each of these PTA has achieved for each agricultural crop. So we compare these two rates and calculate the liberalization, the tariff reduction with a PTA at the crop level. This allows us to identify liberalization at the crop level for each PTA. And we supplement this evidence, statistical evidence, with 15 hours of elite interviews we conducted in Japan and the United States. So key findings is that consistent with our theory, we find that the parliamentary system liberalized geographically concentrated crops compared to presidential systems. And then presidential systems tend to liberalize geographically diffuse crops than parliamentary systems. We're currently analyzing subsidy data using nominal rates of assistance data collected by World Bank. And results are still not robust, so we have to keep working on it. And there's some evidence on subsidies and domestic support. So let me dissect the theory. So the role of executive and legislature in trade and negotiation is that executive negotiates an agreement with partners. And in the United States, this will be president, USTR, and these are all, except for president who are elected from the national district, they tend to be appointed executives who have either executive background in some other places, such as governor and mayors, or policy experts like economists. In a parliamentary system, they tend to be cabinet ministers and prime ministers who are legislators. And then legislature ratifies an agreement and it approves budget. So these two branches do different things that are two wheels of trade liberalization. One is to negotiation to reduce tariff, open market, and the other is to compensate losers and ratify the agreement. So the goals of executive is that they want to negotiate an agreement that can be ratified in a legislature. This came up again and again with an interview with US and Japanese policymakers that they do not want to fail ratification. The second goal of executive is electoral survival of co-partisan in legislature. When trade liberalization produce losers and these districts that incur losses would vote against incumbents, then you lose seats. As an incumbent government, you don't want that to happen. So survival of co-partisans are enormously important goal that should be combined with successful ratification. So legislators oppose liberalization when districts would incur net income losses. So solution here is that the executive should promise compensation to legislators who might oppose ratification and then buy off their support. So this is what we call compensation contract between executive and legislative branches. The problem to enforcing this contract, the promises, one is a commitment problem. There's no legal means to enforce a contract when legislature hear that executive will be delivering compensation, but it didn't happen. They cannot sue the executive saying that you promised us, but it didn't happen. So these political promises are supra-legal, meaning that you cannot use legal means to sue people even if the promise is not delivered. So that's one that makes promises not so credible. The second problem is information asymmetry problem. So legislators representing districts that incur income losses, they have an incentive to inflate the damage when they talk to executives. They say, this is gonna kill me. People are super unhappy. You have to give us this much compensation. And this number, there's an inherent incentive to inflate these numbers because legislators want more compensation than less, and they demand them. So then the executive's job is to really vet this information, asking, is this really true? Can you really survive election with this amount of compensation, or can you actually survive without compensation? So because the resource, financial resources, fiscal resources, not infinite, they have to allocate them properly. And to do so, you need to have information and the ability to vet information that's coming up from districts and legislators about how much compensation they need to survive the next election. So we argue that parliamentary systems mitigate these two problems with stronger party discipline and overlapping agents between executive and legislature. I'm going to explain the mechanism a lot more. While presidential systems worsen this problem with weak party discipline and non-overlapping agents. So because of these differences, compensation contract is formed within the party in a parliamentary system and on the floor for presidential system. Because of these different arenas by which a compensation contract is formed and enforced, we see different patterns of trade liberalization between the two constitutional structures of governments. So let me talk about how stronger party discipline helps form a contract. So when the contract is formed within the party, geographically concentrated industries get liberalized more because politicians at executive only has to deal with a few number of districts. Whereas presidential system, because of the weak party discipline, the contract is enforced with a majoritarian threshold on congressional floor or legislature, that that higher number of districts that are affected by liberalization, geographically diffuse industries, get liberalized more. So, and overlapping agents, the second mechanism that gives credibility to compensation contract in the parliamentary system is overlapping agents between the two branches. So in parliamentary system, the cabinet ministers and prime ministers are legislators, and they know exactly when legislators talk about losers demanding compensation and we can't survive next election, how to vet this information. So this reduces search cost for appropriate price for compensation, and it makes forming and enforcing a compensation contract much easier in parliamentary system. And geographically concentrated industries allow even more efficient information gathering. We can talk about interview evidence in the next couple of slides. By contrast, presidential system, if you look at the USTR, the head of USTR, or people who engage in negotiation, trade negotiations, they rarely had legislative experience, especially in the Congress. So when the executive hear that this congressional district is suffering, that incumbent would likely to lose seat if you can't compensate them, then executive has lower expertise in vetting this information, understanding where the actual needs are when it comes to compensation and electoral survival. They're separate actors, and they have a hard time, executives, vetting information that's coming up from districts and legislators. Here's some interviews evidence from Japan about how geographic concentration helps forming and enforcing compensation contract in a parliamentary systems. This is interview, my interview with Shujiro Urata and Kazunobu Hayakawa with high-ranked bureaucrats, METI and MAF, who were engaged in relatively recent PTA negotiations. Bureaucrats said, if it's only Hokkaido, it is only Hokkaido where industry that was harmed by the agreement is located. So there will be no problem if we can tame Hokkaido. Then we ask, how does it help to have only Hokkaido being affected? Bureaucrats said, a fewer legislators pressure us. Compensation also requires smaller budget. And we asked, so what is the sequence of trade negotiation and negotiation for compensation? Do you negotiate trade agreements first and then talk about compensation? And the bureaucrats said they're completely parallel process, right? Because it's within the party. We present in one package, here's a proposed tariff reduction, and here's a proposed compensation. Another interview about searching for appropriate price for compensation in parliamentary systems. Here's a interview with a former TPP negotiator, the LDP senior legislator. He said, I will call a fellow LDP legislator and ask, what is the maximum tariff reduction you can endure? Meaning, can you survive the next election? And she would give me the number. I pushed back each time and kept yelling at him or her. Is that your final answer? I want your final answer. Sometimes I hung up the phone to show my dissatisfaction with their answers. So clearly, this executive, former legislator who was playing an executive role, negotiating TPP, knows how to vet information. So they're betting it and saying that, I think you can do more. I think you can do more. You can survive election with a little more reduction in tariff, okay? And consistent with this interview materials, the compensation team, so the LDP has made a negotiation team of TPP and the compensation team of TPP. This compensation team of Japanese government consisted of LDP's agricultural tribe politicians with expertise in agriculture. So they pinpoint people who know how to vet information about how much compensation each district needs. They have an inner knowledge and expertise about this. And these are people who are appointed to compensation team of the LDP's TPP negotiation. And then this compensation team and negotiation team travel together for all the TPP negotiations. So because the decision of compensation and tariff reduction tend to happen at the same time, they travel together, they hang out with interest groups at the hotel, and they keep communicating what's going on and decide the amount of compensation. So another way that overlapping agents between executive and legislative branch actually helps enforcing this contract, solving the commitment problem, is by personal appointment. So this is background chronology of positions that Koya Nishikawa, who was a TPP negotiator appointed by LDP, he was a compensation team's chair in 2014. And what you see here is that in 2014, he was appointed as committee chair of TPP compensation. A year later, he was appointed as Minister of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fishery, which has a big jurisdiction over agricultural products and allocation of agricultural budgets. Okay, so you see that the TPP compensation, as a head of compensation, Koya Nishikawa was able to promise compensation during the TPP negotiation. And a year later, he was Minister of Agriculture, who was able to allocate budget consistent with the promises. Here's another similar career path of Hiroshi Moriyama. So in 2015, he was a Minister of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries. And 2018, he was a committee chair of TPP compensation and EU-Japan trade agreements compensation for the LDP. And a year before 2015, he was also committee chair of TPP compensation. So you see this promise being made as a TPP compensation team and becoming a minister. And these positions enhance each other in terms of boosting the credibility of the promise that government makes to legislatures. Okay. And here's how interview evidence on how personnel appointments solve the commitment problem from the former chair of the LDP TPP compensation committee. This is the only interview that I conducted myself alone. So I have my name in here. I said, this works great. You can promise various measures to farmers during the TPP negotiation as a head of TPP coordination team of the LDP. And then you return home from the negotiation and you can follow through the promises as a Minister of Agriculture. And he said, exactly. Okay, so we talked about this, but it's just visualizing how in presidential system, number can be power, because it's all about what happened in legislative floor, whereas in parliamentary system, concentration helps because you're dealing with a fewer number of legislators within the party in making promises and delivering the promise of compensation. So to wrap up, hypothesis that we test is parliamentary system are more likely to liberalize geographically concentrated products and protect geographically diffuse products. And the presidential system are more likely to liberalize geographically diffuse products and protect geographically concentrated products. So we test this with remote sensed Cropland data from Arstat. This is a land cover around 2000. We combine remote sensed data and subnational, this data set, the Arstat, combine remote sensed data and subnational census data. In case remote sensing doesn't do a good job differentiating products. And the unit is a ground resolution of 10 square kilometer land, cropland, and for total 175 agricultural products. The advantages to remote sense data, it's standardized across the globe, and measurement errors are relatively uncorrelated with politics or government capacity. And geographic concentration calculation are not constrained by administrative borders, right? Such as province, state, prefectures, municipalities, etc. So here is some example of a map Tomoya has beautifully made. So rice, you see, and this is well known, we have so many rice farmers and it's all over Japan, very diffused, highly protected. Sugar, on the other hand, very highly concentrated, Okinawa, Kagoshima area. And since Japan entered many PTA negotiations, sugar comes up a lot as something that reduces tariff over time. So what's interesting here is that if you look at the United States, US also has heavily concentrated sugar industry on Florida, but sugar enjoys very high tariff in the United States. So you see this difference as an example of sugar industry, that concentration leads to more liberalization in Japan, whereas a concentration leads to continued tariff protection for the United States. So here's the measurement of geographic concentration. We use a typical measure of Half-Inter-Halfman index. And here's how we calculate it. It's very standard. It's for the crop, for each of the cell and the country. Large value of Half-Inter-Halfman index indicates concentration. Lower value means diffusion. We match this geographic concentration data for each crop with tariff line at HS6 level. And there's a lot of challenge to this margin to data sets because product name differ. So Tomoya I hired 3 RAs in Japan who went through the product name and did a great job matching. It's a very labor intensive process. So data is country PTA crop, and it's a 237 unique PTAs. It's all democracies. Outcome variable is liberalization, a tariff reduction in the PTA, and main explanatory variable is geographic concentration, and dummy variable indicating parliamentary system or not, and we interact these 2 key covariates. So here's a baseline specification, and here's the results. So what you see here, this is a baseline specification without covariates. What we expect, what our theory predict is that parliamentary system should have an upward slope, meaning that more concentrated they are, more likely to liberalize. Whereas a presidential system should have a negative slope, more diffuse they are, which is on the left side of x-axis, more likely to be liberalized. And you see that, yes, presidential system negative slope, parliamentary system seems relatively flat. Although if you look at the difference between presidential and parliamentary, you see this converging, the downward slope and upward slope toward the right side of the figure, which is consistent with our theory. Once we add covariates, such as production values, export status, GDP per capita, etc., we see that, yes, parliamentary system has upward slope, consistent with our theory, and presidential system relatively more flat, but gradual downward slope, which is also consistent with our theory. So far, the results on tariff reduction is looking great. The subsidy analysis is still in progress. So because this speaker series is about policy innovations, do I have time? I set the timer to 35 minutes.
You're at 35 minutes, so maybe take a couple minutes to
Sure.
finish up.
Okay, this is the end. Okay, great. So because this series is about policy innovation, we like to talk about whether institutional solutions to presidential systems, basically being stuck with this failure of compensation equilibrium. So we went through in the paper 4 different solutions. Party discipline, we talked about this already. It seems like it's impossible to strengthen party discipline without something else, especially without the fiscal resources. So we would not talk about it. But US has devised many interesting innovations to deal with this credibility problem. One is the formulaic compensation. So instead of executive making promises, why don't we institutionalize it like trade adjustment assistance? So how it works is that the industries or workers fill out the form that they get harmed by trade liberalization, and executive read and vet it, and then bureaucratic organization give formulaic compensation to these import injuries. So the problem here is that it solves commitment problem, right? Because you don't have to make promises. It's been institutionalized. So TAA solves the commitment problem that plugged this failure of compensation in presidential system, but it does not solve this information asymmetry problem about legislators complaining to the executive that they're going to lose seats and votes. TAA doesn't help. So another institutional innovation that USTR has come up with, and this is very interesting, is called consultation system. So they said, we need more information from legislators about their district, how much suffering that they have to endure with trade liberalization. So USTR appointed people who have political experiences, former legislators, retired, and send them out to a caravan to talk to legislators and district interests about what they want in trade agreements. However, USTR official has complained, and this is not in our interview, but official reports of the system, that even though they reach out to try to talk and gather information from legislators and industries, they are too busy and they don't want to talk to them during the trade negotiation phase because they know it doesn't matter. But when it comes to ratification phase in the Congress, they rush to meet with USTR. So this timing of consultation system finally working, which is toward the end of ratification, is consistent with our theory, right? That legislators are not trying to influence trade negotiation outcome, but rather that they are trying to influence compensation during the ratification phase. So this system solves information asymmetry problems to some extent, because the people who have expertise of vetting information, but it does not solve commitment problem. Finally, we can appoint people who have experience being a legislators, like USTR does. This also solves information asymmetry problem, but not a commitment problem. So I know Meti has been talking about implementing TAA, but my sense is that a TAA only solves one type of problem, but not the other. And I think Japanese parliamentary system is working pretty well when it comes to solving commitment problem and information asymmetry problems. So here's the implications for US-Japan relations. So presidential systems such as the US are more vulnerable to legislative opposition to trade liberalization due to the failure of compensation. So we have to understand this vulnerability coming from constitutional structures. And ratification concern is more real for US policymakers. This accounts for why we see backlash against free trade in the United States, but not in Japan. So here's a conclusion. It's a repetition of what we said, so I'll stop here. But here's a future task. We have to do causal identification. We have some ideas. And we have to talk about generalizability beyond agriculture. Thank you so much for listening. And I look forward to hear your thoughts and comments.
So much, Megumi. That's fascinating. Of course, you know I like to study agricultural trade politics, so this is wonderful. And I'm curious who is being compensated. So I hear one part where you're talking about compensation to legislators, where having only a few politicians in Hokkaido makes it easier to compensate. At another dimension, it's compensation of the farmer, where it's, you know, trade adjustment assistance or some other means to help the individual who's suffering from trade. My guess is that both are important, that, you know, how do you structure political bargains that might work for the politician? And sometimes that must go through helping the losers who are directly affected by trade. But I do wonder if your argument is more conditioned on the idea of compensating in a political bargain that might not necessarily make the injured workers, farmers, whole. So that's my question. And I also, before you answer me, want to turn over to one of our associates, Gabby Chung, who is a PhD recipient from University of Southern California, now here as an associate with the program on US-Japan relations, doing research on backlash mitigation. And she would like to ask you a question.
Thank you, Professor Davis, and Professor Naoi, thanks so much for sharing your latest research with us. It's very inspiring, and I've learned a lot, and it seems particularly timely in light of yesterday's election results from France, given the vote share for the far-right candidate. My question relates to the effects of international pressure on the compensation contract. It seems that your theory holds international pressure constant, while existing theories and evidence point to a general consensus that geopolitical alliances, they all play an important role in motivating governments to liberalize trade. And I would like to know whether there may be an interaction effect between presidential versus parliamentary system and how they respond to international pressure. Thank you.
Great. Should I answer Gabby's and yours first, or should we collect more questions?
Why don't you answer those two, and then I'll collect some more questions.
Great. So Christina's question about who gets compensated, this is a very interesting question, because I think the manufacturing industries and agriculture have a very different structure of compensation. We talked about this in the paper that circulated. However, for manufacturing, it seems that the emergence of welfare system in Europe and elsewhere were motivated by industrial workers' demand for occupational safety and welfare program. So we see that there's more universalistic programs for industry workers that are hurt by liberalization in democracies, whereas agriculture seems to be enormously targeted. It's a product-based compensation, not the sector-based compensation in most of the cases. So by focusing on agriculture, I think we are emphasizing that the compensation goes to legislators and particular type of crop producers. And the design of this compensation really varies across crops and products. And it's almost anywhere. Japan, United States, it's a very product-specific compensation programs. So because of this, I think when we think about who get compensated, I think our argument is about legislators who would lose votes and potentially seats getting compensated. And we kind of bracket how this compensation go through legislators to particular products. But I think the geographic concentration of industries and parliamentary system helps this contract, because it's a agricultural compensation tend to be product specific, right? And when the particular product is concentrated in a particular district, it makes it easier for executive to deal with one or two legislators and say, hey, we can do this. We can legislate this product-specific type budget, and you'll be okay. So that would be my answer, that the manufacturing industries and agriculture, very different design of compensation. Agriculture, very product-specific, and this facilitates concentrated industry parliamentary system to negotiate and a credible compensation contract. So for Gabby's excellent questions about external pressures, international pressures for liberalization, there's another work that I've been working on how voters perceive their government to be powerful in trade negotiations and how that changed their demand for compensation. What's interesting is that when you look at the TPP negotiation, I devised nationally representative surveys, but Japanese people think that the Japanese government is not powerful in trade negotiations. US voters think that the US government is powerful. And because US voters think that their government is powerful, they get more upset if they can't strike a deal that favors their industries. So the demand for compensation and the backlash is stronger in US, partly because it's presidential system and there's a failure of compensation, but also because voters perceive their government to be mighty. Whereas Japan, they think they're weak, so they don't demand much. So there's an interesting interaction, as you predicted, between external pressures and demand for compensation. Great questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have a question from Tae-Gyun Lim, who's a PhD student in the Department of Government.
Can I say no? Yeah, you can just speak. Oh, okay. Hello, it was a wonderful presentation, and I have two questions about the presentation, and one is about the regional variation in the effect of the argument. So parliamentary systems are usually clustered around the European systems and other Canada and Australia, as far as I know, and presidential systems are more clustered in Africa and Latin America. Then are there kind of like different, because like some studies suggest that there are divergent effect of political institutions depending on the region. And the second is about the collective actions of farmers. So this paper is basically about the top-down arguments of the executive and legislator bargaining, deciding the degree of the trade liberalization. But on the other hand, geographical concentration might affect the collective action problems of farmers in pressuring the trade liberalization. And how does this kind of bottom-up theory fit into this argument? That was my question. Thank you.
Should I answer or correct one more?
Yeah, I think go ahead, since you got two questions there.
Great. Thank you. Great to meet you and great questions. So regional variations, we were also concerned. So one thing is that because EU negotiates trade agreements, we don't have European Union countries in our data set because tariff reduction will be all the same, although compensation actually differs. So that would be interesting to look at. However, we are aware that presidential systems tend to be polar and they tend to be newer democracies, as you suspected. So we do control for GDP per capita. We also use crop fixed effects, which I think is pretty powerful. And then other things. And there are very few South-South agreements. I think in our data set, it's mostly North-South or North-North agreements. So I don't know how much of this regional biases or concentration of particular historical conditions actually bias our analysis. But I think the next step probably would be to do a little more subset analysis, looking at regional dummies interacting with what we have analyzed to see whether there are variations across regions. So it's a great question. The second question is about collective action. So the conventional wisdom, of course, is that concentrated industries should be more powerful, demanding compensation or trade protection, right? Because they are more likely to be able to overcome collective action problem. But what we see is that it depends on political institutions. Another thing that collective action argument has not theorized or has not considered is when you have two substitutive policy instruments, right? In this case, we're looking at tariff to protect industries, and we're looking at subsidies to compensate industries. We consider these two to be substitutive, right? You get rid of tariff, you compensate them. And collective action prediction would say, okay, both cases, geographically concentrated industries should be protected with tariff and should be compensated with subsidies. And that's a big question that I think we should be doing with a subsidy analysis, whether these coefficients show the negative sign that basically tariff reduction is associated with increase in subsidies after PTA to lend strong support to the substitution argument. And collective action theory doesn't predict these differences between the two instruments. So that'll be my short answer to your question. Thank you.
Great. We have a couple of additional questions from Aki Nakai. He asks you, after thanking you for the fascinating presentation, about how the electoral system variation within parliamentary systems could matter. And did you see any difference between proportional representation, single-member district, or other forms of electoral institutions that we see in parliamentary government?
Great question. So we should actually study this. We should empirically analyze this. Instead of parliamentary presidential dummy, we could be doing PR and majoritarian. The one thing that we haven't done this is that this been studied extensively. Stephanie Lickard's book, Spending to Win, is exactly on this topic. And she didn't use the remote sense data, but she uses standardized European Union country data on geographic concentration. And it shows that, yes, electoral system matters quite a bit. And so I think our job is to show that this parliamentary presidential dichotomy that we demonstrate is not spurious to electoral system differences. And it's a constitutional structure that is doing the work.
We have a question from Mina Pullman that gets at the broader dimensions of why you might see protection of agriculture. And she highlights how food security is also a concern. And do you see the food security arguments, which have been a rationale for protection, as shaping policy, or do you think they're just rhetoric?
Great question. So the timing in which food security became so big coincide with two-party competition that emerged through DPJ's popularity and winning upper house election in 2007. So this has been around. The food security arguments has been around, but seems that the Japanese government, the LDP government, has spent a lot more effort since then, and they changed. I can talk more about this. They established this Food Action Nippon program, which is to promote domestic consumption of domestically produced food. And they did all sorts of campaign about how food security ratio in Japan is too low. But this campaign ended, as I understand it, about the time that Prime Minister Abe's cabinet administration has entered a TPP negotiation. The tone of the campaign changed. Even the public opinion survey that the cabinet office has fielded about food security has changed. That I think that they started to invest more effort into actually pushing public toward accepting trade liberalization. This is part of my second book, so I'm not gonna spoil too much, but you see a huge change. So food security issue, safety issue also was huge in mid-2000 to 2012 or 13. But you see the big change in how government de-promote this agenda kind of try to offset this campaign that they've been engaged in now, and now try to mobilize coalition for free trade with public opinion. And I think Gabi and I will be talking about this a lot tomorrow.
Do we have any other questions? We're nearly to the end of our time. Then I get to pull in on agriculture exports, because part of shifting away from food security has been to push forward on agriculture exports, even Japan trying to promote. But we know that many of the countries in your sample, the United States or New Zealand, are major agricultural exporters. And so could your argument go beyond explaining where you see liberalization because you're able to compensate? How does it explain the flip side of where do you see pressure to liberalize because you're working hard for a concentrated export industry? We know that American agricultural pressure on Japan has been on behalf of US agricultural exports.
Great question. So empirically, we try to differentiate these things by including the control variables of export-import values, or whether they already have lower tariff rates, like a zero tariff rates to begin with, then we try to dummy that out in the regressions. So empirically, we have dealt with this. But theoretically, our theory is all about losers, which doesn't consider winners. Our analysis also is a country, crop country PTA analysis, and we're not looking at dyadic strategic interactions between agricultural powerhouse like United States and import competing country like Japan. So definitely the next step, we should be thinking about it, but not in this iteration of the paper, I don't think.
Okay, well, you already include quite a bit, and explaining the politics of compensating losers is a very important foundation for understanding trade. Thank you so much. We've really learned a lot from you sharing your research. I wish we could continue the conversation, and I'll reach out to you, as should others who have additional questions. So I would like to thank you very much for your presentation, and thank all of you who joined us for the seminar today.
Thank you so much.